Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here with you and to welcome you all. And it's a privilege indeed to be introducing a personality who I believe has been a towering figure in British politics and has made a very strong public statement, especially during the war on Iran. Clare Short was born in Birmingham in 1946. Prior to entering Parliament, she worked in the Home Office. Then she became an MP for Birmingham. Then she occupied many positions in Labour's front benches, Shadow Minister for Women, Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, and then spokesperson for the opposition. And then another job with regards to development overseas. In addition to that, Clare served as a member of the Labour's National Executive Council between 1997 and 1998. When Labour returned to power in 1997, Clare was appointed to the very important portfolio as First Secretary of State for International Development. Clare, and I remember that clearly, and I told some students here that when Clare stood ferociously in Parliament, they were not born actually, but she resigned from the government in 2003, and then clearly served as a backbench Labour MP until she resigned in 2006. But Clare resigning from Parliament is one thing, and leaving public life is another matter, which she did not. She left parliamentary politics in 2010 and went to work with a number of institutions committed to international development. And this is how as well we have known Clare as a politician who has been fighting for just causes, and Palestine is one of them. So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to present Her Excellency Clare Short, who will be delivering a 10-12 minute speech. After that, we will move to our second speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Clare Short.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and Mr. President. I think every decent human being should be concerned and distressed by what we've lived through that's happened to Gaza in these last 17, 18 months. We've seen cruelty and war before, but nothing quite as terrible as this, which many serious scholars consider to be a genocide, and I find that argument persuasive, and indeed the International Court of Justice said that there's a plausible case for saying that it's genocide, and they mean that in a legal sense, not just as a piece of rhetoric. So everyone should be concerned, but British people, and people living in this country should be even more concerned, because Britain had a very important historical role in helping to bring about the conditions that have led to all this cruelty and endless slaughter. I remember Judge Straw, when he was Foreign Secretary, saying whenever he got to some intractable problem across the world, it was often the residue of British colonial history. I'm not sure if it's true of everywhere, but it's true that there are residues that leave trouble around the world. So, special responsibility on us living here to inform ourselves about the situation, the cruelty that's taking place, and the instability and conflict that's spreading across the Middle East, which is terrible for the people and dangerous for the world. At the end of the Second World War, it was a period of progress after all that slaughter and death and killing. 50 million people died in the Second World War, half of them Russian, half civilians, half military, half Russians. So when they have these commemorations and don't invite the Russians, do you think, doesn't anyone want to remember the truths of history? But that's another subject. But at the end of the war, in order to prevent such events happening again, the world agreed to establish the United Nations, and one of its core provisions in the Charter was that no country could take territory from another by force. And this prohibition was elaborated by various provisions of international law, which were to be policed by the International Court of Justice. And they've made various rulings recently, and I want to come back to that. From the beginning of the Zionist movement, there was a determination to take over Palestine from the river to the sea, Eretz Israel. Now, whenever people calling for justice for Palestinians say from the river to the sea, they're denounced. But there's plenty of people within Israel who claim that they should take over from the river to the sea. But, of course, that is acceptable. And there was always a plan, and the new Israeli historians showed this years ago, to remove the indigenous population and to take the land. That's always been in the thinking. It's cruder and more open now, but it's been there in the plan from the very beginning. And so from that time on, there's been trouble. It was always possible for Jews to live in Palestine, and many did, and lived in peace with their neighbours. It's absolutely wrong to suggest that there was something about Palestinians that was anti-Jew. The anti-Semitism was a European disease. It wasn't anything like the same ugliness across the Arab world at all. But the Palestinians are supposed to remedy justice for the Jews for what Europe did to them. So there was peace, and there was a mixed community of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and so on. But it was, and of course there could have been more Jews coming to live in Palestine if there'd been a shared management, if Britain had set up democratic institutions, which they should have done under the mandate that was given to them. But no, it was bias, and there wasn't any setup of a democratic state, and so the Palestinians lost out and lost out and lost out. And it was the determination to drive the Palestinians out that has caused the massive displacement and suffering. Most of the population of Gaza originated from this displacement in 1948. And there are people sitting there whose grandfathers say, we used to live there, and we used to live there, and they can't even go and visit. I mean, imagine. And of course, another war in 67, another massive displacement, and Israel refused the right of return, despite international law requiring that should be permitted, and UN resolutions calling for it. So there are now 59 refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. UNRWA, who you may have heard of lately, the United Nations Relief and Works Association, was set up by the UN to provide for the refugees until a settlement was reached. And of course it was expected that soon there would be a settlement. But UNRWA is still there, making provision, not just for emergency relief, but for education and healthcare for all these people in all these camps. And now Israel is determined to close down UNRWA, and has taken all sorts of steps against it, not just recently, which you may have heard of, but over the years, to try and take away those services or the recognition of people that they are refugees and that they shouldn't be displaced from their lands. Of course, what Israel is doing was done in the United States, in Australia, and in Canada. The removal of the indigenous population by mass slaughter and ethnic cleansing. Of course, under British colonial tutelage. And that is why scholars refer to Israel as a settler colonial state. Maybe that was the inspiration, the same idea, not just to go and live there alongside people, but to clean them out and take the land. That's always been the idea, and that's what's caused all the trouble. International law outlaws settlement in occupied territories. That's territory taken by force. You're not allowed to have settlements to change. There's all sorts of rules clearly set out by the UN since its establishment. But Israel ignores the law and the rulings of the International Court of Justice on this question, as on so many others, and constantly expands its settlements and constantly displaces people. Now leading figures in the Israeli government and President Trump are openly advocating the ethnic cleansing of all the 2 million people of Gaza. So after this bombardment for 18 months, they're planning to move all the people out and develop that land beside the sea for part of Israel. Completely in breach of international law, utter cruelty. And of course the Palestinians, who are the children of displaced people, are not going to give in and are not going to move, because they know what happened in the past. The United States, the European Union and the UK do nothing to restrain Israel and to uphold international law. The reason I'm giving this historical thing is that there is a remedy. If we would all unite in upholding international law, we could get peace and justice. This isn't just some hopeless conflict that can never be ended. So it's a tragedy and a failure on the part of the United States, the European Union and the UK, and indeed Canada, Australia and so on, to do nothing to restrain Israel and to uphold international law. If Israel was made to honour international law, they wouldn't be able to take over the West Bank and Gaza, and it's not allowed. And then you'd have to give it back to the people and you'd get the beginning of some hope and a way of getting a settlement and getting some peace. We would have had some kind of solution long ago, but Israel is allowed to keep breaking international law, the rulings of the International Court of Justice, and nothing is done to hold them to the law. And I want to just underline, it would not need any conflict with Israel in order to hold them to international law. You'd simply refuse to supply them with arms, limit their access to markets, and the European market is fantastically important. It's one of the biggest markets in the world, and it's near to them. And it has, on all its trade treaties, a provision about both parties are honouring and respecting international law and international norms. And Israel doesn't, but the European Union still gives privileged access to its market. I just want to point out that the remedies are there. They don't have to be violent or anything, and you could hold Israel to international law and get a solution. Most countries of the global south vote strongly in the UN General Assembly for enforcement of international law, but the Security Council does not, and whenever the issues of the day come before the Security Council, the United States vetoes, and often the UK joins the vetoing vote. As well as the horrors of Gaza that you've all seen recently, and it's the first genocide that's online and that we can all observe on a daily, weekly basis. Israel has been found guilty by very reputable organisations of the international crime of apartheid, and that was entrenched in international law in response to the situation in South Africa. And that is the treatment of the Palestinians as second-class citizens in Israel itself. 20% of the population are Palestinians in Israel, but there's very much second-class citizens as well as the people of the occupied territories. And of course, many countries and scholars, and among them are many Jewish scholars of the Holocaust and of the original idea of genocide, and the International Court of Justice, as I said, have found Israel guilty of the crime of genocide in Gaza. And what do our governments do? Well, it was never again, never again. Well, what are we doing? Never again. We're planning, or big powers are planning more of it. It's notable that President Trump says frequently that it's terrible that so many young Russians and Ukrainians are dying in that terrible war. And I think he's a monster, but I agree with him about that. I do agree, but there's got to be, that war has got to be brought to an end. It's just more and more young soldiers from Russia and Ukraine dying endlessly, and as Russia takes more and more land slowly. But he says nothing of Gaza. If he's upset by people dying in that war, why isn't he upset by all the children who've been dying in Gaza? Instead, he advocates the complete ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Since the October 7th attack and nearly 2 years of slaughter in Gaza, an increasing killing and displacement of people in the West Bank, Israel has also attacked southern Lebanon and is occupying large parts of southern Lebanon and is also occupying large parts of Syria. So the disorder and displacement and trouble across the Middle East is growing and spreading. My conclusion is that as well as this being a terrible tragedy, it's spreading suffering and instability in all the surrounding countries, and it will continue until there is a just settlement. Oppressed people revolt. It took us a long time to get peace in Northern Ireland. And then we end up with someone who was on the side of the IRA shaking hands with the Queen. That's what you have to do. And people who are oppressed and have their lands taken and so on, they resist over long periods of time. History teaches that wherever you look. This issue, this conflict, this suffering, this cruelty is enraging people across the world, including many Jews, and that's one of the causes for hope. Young Jews in America, and on the big demonstrations in London, calling for ceasefires and justice for the Palestinians. There's a big block, big Jewish block, and they have a big sign saying Jewish block. And very movingly, there are people who hold banners saying, as the descendant of Holocaust, people who suffered in the Holocaust, I do not defend what is being done. That's very honourable and fine, isn't it, and important and moving. And of course, what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank is enraging for the people of the Middle East. And of course, there's lots of dictatorships in that region. But what are people to do? If we're furious and there's fury across the world, how furious are they, the near neighbours, the people who share a language and a history? But so far, the US, the EU, the UK, and so on, failed to take action to uphold international law, which is therefore crumbling, not just in relation to this awful conflict, but in relation to the whole worldwide order. And if there are no principles and laws, might is right and chaos spreads. So it's crumbling in front of our eyes, and it endangers the future across the planet at a time of mounting instability that will grow because of climate change. So however long it goes on, if we don't do the right thing, and it's possible to do the right thing, not only will the people of this region continue to suffer terribly, but the whole world order will disintegrate and cause dreadful trouble for everyone. So please engage and do what you can. Thank you very much.